Hello, everybody. My name is Petros, and I'm going to be one of the speakers for you today. In case you folks are wondering where I'm hailing from, today I'm calling from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh from Turtle Island, also known as Vancouver in British Columbia, Canada. So the topic for you today is a bit daunting, and hopefully you folks um, find this interesting. But it's on the topic of how to build a just and democratic, or the case for building a just and democratic post-pandemic society. And it's a bit of a call to action for you folks and what I'm calling field notes for young change makers like yourselves who are trying to do some good in the world. So um, to get us going, I'm going to provide a bit of an executive summary. I'm a management consultant, so I can't help but do so. What is the challenge that's facing today? The pandemic plus the existing crises that we're facing, plus the Great Depression, is equaling to what I believe is a severely impacted youth, our generation, millennials, Gen Z, and more importantly as well, a global democratic recession in that our generation is increasingly losing faith in democracies and democratic institutions and democratic politics altogether. What I think is the solution to that is we need to progressively retrofit our 20th century democratic institutions for the 21st century to solve these crises and to also rebuild democratic faith that we have in our institutions. And I think I find solace in knowing that this has been done before. That this moment that we're in isn't all of a sudden, as folks say in the media, it's not an it's not an unprecedented moment. We've been here before, and there's a lot of lessons for us to learn from the past. But it's important to note that the work is not going to be easy. That's going to be a lot of work. So what's the call to action? Getting you folks, the privileged, the educated, the folks who have the wherewithal to kind of focus on making it our mission to have our public institutions tackle these crises that we're facing. And I think the field notes, as someone who's humble, who's I don't know, and the reason I got selected, I guess, for this is because the organizers believed I do a lot of this advocacy kind of work, and I'm a change maker, so to speak. So my observations of being in the field, not a master class by any means, is that we need folks with EQ and with mission, and by EQ I mean the empathy quotient versus just the intelligence quotient. We need folks who are wanting to get started, to just do it, to show and tell, to not focus on the perfection. And we need folks who are also what I'm calling BBC squared. So folks who focus on building better coalitions and who are being better collaborators as well. And I think that's going to be the high level takeaway of what I'm going to be talking about with you today. So there it is. You can pretty much dial out and you kind of got the gist of the presentation. But if you spare me, at least another 30 minutes of your time, we'll kind of give you a bit more stats, stories, and dive into a bit more depth into some of the lessons that I've learned. So that's that. Why don't we start off by talking about my story a little bit? So, and I think it's maybe worthwhile to know this just because to kind of understand where is it that perhaps I'm coming from, and I like to start off with the map because when I mention Eritrea, most folks have no idea where it is on the map. So my parents escaped from Eritrea, this small country here that you see right above Ethiopia, and that has the little heart on it. My parents escaped Eritrea at the height of its independence war as refugees back in the early 80s or so, and they kind of made their way up to well, they kind of went across the desert, made their way to the Middle East, and then ended up in Italy. And there, they were able to seek refuge to Canada, and that's where myself, my siblings, were born and raised. But we actually ended up returning back to Eritrea. post-independence. So when I was 10, growing up in Edmonton, we had kind of packed up our bags and moved back. And that for me was a really formative moment. And it really sparked my lifelong interest in how, and particularly how governments respond to the disruptive forces. And in this case, in Eritrea, it was commerce. It was free trade. That the country had decided that um, it was better off not engaging with the forces of globalization and institutions of free trade, and to kind of have it a go it alone protectionist policies. And there growing up, witnessed my dad's booming electronics store close down. My friends try to flee the country as refugees in hopes of better career prospects abroad. And when I had the privilege of just returning back to Canada with my Canadian passport, trying to finish off the rest of my high school, you couldn't help but feel a sense of survivor's guilt, because you realize that there's such a thing called the geography lottery, and you're all the things that you're kind of endowed with in life is to a certain degree due to fortune and to luck and to nothing of your own doing. And if I had been born in worse circumstances, that would have written the fate for most of my life. So that shaped me, and ultimately triggered my passion about social justice. A realization that um, that we I think that idea of a geography lottery was really what kind of shaped my sense of, we have largely an unjust world, but what we can do is try to make it such that everyone has equal footing for the most part. And it also triggered my passion for public service. So trying to find champion policies that not only make it easier for folks to, let's say, create generate wealth, but uh, broadly distributed wealth, but to most importantly safeguard those who are most vulnerable from other disruptive waves and that countries and societies may face. So uh, you know, I work at Deloitte now. I'm a corporate strategy consultant there. And I had the opportunity to witness some of these disruptions firsthand. I had this one project where our client was this big oil and gas refinery in the prairies in Canada. And the project was figure out what is the cost to fully automate this entire refinery such that we have as little or no people as possible working here, but it's automated to the nth degree, or it's stationed and manned by folks who are working remotely from downtown offices in various cities. And getting a taste for those kind of projects was eye-opening, because it gave you a true sense of like, okay, the future is here and it's coming and it's going to be remarkably disruptive. But also B, that okay, I need to immediately shift my work to the public sector. So for the past couple of years, I've been very focused on the transformations that we make within our public sector clients. More specifically, how do we improve their own digital transformations and therefore improve citizen service delivery, which I think reinstills faith that people have in governments, because they see them less competent when they know that they're digitally enabled and they're getting a Netflix type experience as opposed to a blockbuster type experience, if that makes sense. And also, what are ways that we can support? And one of the big things I'm focusing on now at work is developing a global strategy on the way that Deloitte can support our public sector clients on the topic of tackling the climate crisis. So in my role and formal hat as the firm's global civil government specialist, that's what I do. But ever since my undergraduate days to now, I've always been a pretty active community volunteer and organizer, so engaged through various organizations, be it from encouraging youth to get out the vote during elections to building affordable housing for Black folks in the Lower Mainland in BC. So now that you know a little bit about me, I'm going to try and shift my focus on to something I've been thinking a lot about over the past year, on the challenges that we're facing collectively today. So the challenge, clearly, the pandemic is number one, and it's important to note here that I'm of the view, and as you've probably heard many times elsewhere, the pandemic has been an accelerant for the most part of existing crises and trends, and not necessarily a change agent for them. They're not, the pandemic has really lifted the blinds that so many of us have had on crises before that we've been facing pre-pandemic. So we're only realizing now to what degree, um, these other crises have been existing or percolating in the background. But the pandemic itself, clearly its own massive crisis that we need to solve and figure out for. And it's important to know that even with the pandemic, there's remarkably disproportionate impacts. You have, I think I saw a stat, something along the lines of, for folks who are earning less than 30K per year, they're 5 times more likely to get COVID than those who are earning 100K. And it's why, because if you earn more than 100K, you're, let's say, management consultant at Deloitte, you're 6 times more likely to be able to work from home than those who don't. So the pandemic, huge crisis with remarkably disproportionate impacts across the population. Now we've had 3 other crises that have been taking place pre-pandemic that we're now getting exposed to. So that's our economic system that's remarkably unequal and problematic. There's a lot of these platitudes of saying that we're all in this together, but we're really not. Right now, we're seeing these K-shaped recoveries in our economies, where you have a sliver of high-income, highly educated folks rebounding, quickly with their salaries, career trajectories during the pandemic, whereas those lower-income workers are seeing further, reduction in hours, job losses, automations of their roles, and the challenge here is that, in addition to that, we're also seeing that this is disproportionately impacting women. So, folks who are experts are calling it a she-cession because most economic recessions actually impact men. And on top of that, we're seeing remarkably wide gaps, obviously, within our income inequality in the country. So that's starting to get worse, especially as we see like a huge decoupling of the economy itself, where you have massive job losses, it's struggling, lots of small businesses closing, and for those of you who've been investing, if you have been investing, or maybe investing your student loans, whatever you're doing, you'll know that the stock market has been doing bananas. It's been doing insane. So I think folks are kind of figuring out that something isn't connecting. This doesn't feel right. And I think that if you like watching reality, streaming TV services as well, and if you haven't seen the show Chernobyl on HBO, highly recommend it. But I thought that show was good, and it's because like Chernobyl, like the nuclear disaster of Chernobyl in the 1980s, it had shattered at the time the faith that folks had in communism of the Soviet Union. And I think that particularly with the US and the remarkable utter failure in trying to address the pandemic with their laissez-faire approach of just kind of, let's see how things shake up, and their unbelief, shattered belief in unfettered capitalism. I think that you have a lot of folks now who are questioning that, and they look at the U.S. and they think to themselves, 5% of the world's population, but over 20% of the world's cases and deaths. Like this doesn't make sense. And pre-pandemic, you had surveys from Edelman and whatnot showing that I think there's a stat from Canada: 47% of Canadians agree that capitalism, as it exists today, does more harm than good in the world. So it's not logical to believe that post-pandemic, we're going to find that a lot of folks are going to want to have a new sort of economic system that is more compassionate, that's more caring, that's more equitable at the end of the day, and sustainable too. Which leads to the next topic. Other crisis we've been kind of opened our eyes onto is crises of racial injustice, and particularly for those in Canada on reconciliation. Um, you know, it's pretty kind of obvious for the most part. There's stats that I could be listing off, whether it's 1/3 of children in Black families live in poverty compared to those to the 1/10 of the rest of the population in Canada. Blacks being twice as employed as the entire population pre-pandemic, and for those who even had the same amount of education, there were significant income gaps as well. And not to mention just all of the really poor stats as it relates to Indigenous peoples and the so many instances of systemic racism that exists. There's now a heightened awareness and a real sense of wanting to tackle these issues. So There's that crisis. And what we also have is obviously the climate crisis. And of everyone trying to race towards the Paris goals of having, was it global average temperatures below 2 degrees Celsius of pre-industrial levels by 2050. Some scientists are saying that we're kind of past the point of no return. That if anything, we need to be finding ways to aggressively, capture our existing carbon. So, if we think this pandemic is going to be bad, the slow and ruinous pain that climate change is going to kind of unfold on us is probably not going to feel any better. So, with all of these crises existing, there's also a new trend that COVID-19 has been accelerating, and that's as termed by Professor Scott Galloway, the trend of the Great Dispersion. So that's it's describing a set of technological and cultural trends that disperse ever larger segments of the economy without regard of existing distribution channels. So, what does that really mean? Well, think about it this way. We now have a huge part of the population who are probably not going to want to return to work in the office, who are probably going to take up the conveniences of wanting to order food through groceries through Instacart, who are essentially increasing our convenience, which is all amazing and fantastic. But the implication of that is that we're having less face-to-face friction with one another, less face-to-face run-ins, opportunities for folks from radically different socioeconomic backgrounds, upbringings, communities to actually intermingle with one another. And that the concern can be that this form of self-segregation that may be taking place actually reduces our empathy towards one another. That as we become increasingly retreating to the comfort of our own homes and apartments, that what we do is we actually make it harder for us to break out of our own physical and also digital social media bubbles. And there's a concern that, what if the social distancing of today becomes the unintentional structural distancing of tomorrow? And what are the implications to, let's say, democracy, to societies, if you're having less of the mingle with one another from different groups and backgrounds as you would in an office, where you run in and you meet coworkers from radically different places and age groups and et cetera. What does that spell for, let's say, what our societies are going to look like? Now, when you add all of this up, what do we get? This pandemic is likely and potentially going to scar our generation for years to come. And it's not fair to say, especially with youth, we're bearing a disproportionate amount of pain during this pandemic with job losses, stay-at-home measures, disruptions to our education, despite being also the least impacted by the virus itself. We're the least likely to die and get sick, obviously. And the implications of this pandemic are going to be wide-ranging, whether it's jobs. So, right now, youth are 2.5 times more likely to get a job, to be without a job, than those above the ages of 26 to 64. And you'll know that if you've taken a labor economics course in university before, you'll know that graduating during a recession, unemployed, can have scarring effects on future wages. And on top of that, let's say you're fortunate enough to even get a job. We know that burnout culture is strong and is a byproduct of this, of kind of like feeling like you have to kind of hustle and get burnt out and what have you. And it's producing a sense of hopelessness, since you feel like you're rarely accomplishing anything. You're exhausted. You have an ever-growing list of tasks, et cetera, et cetera. And not to mention, there's also the mental health challenges. Researchers know after large-scale disasters, depression spikes, PTSD spikes, and also being having precarious work circumstances. We're going to have a generation with a huge mental health pandemic as well. Is the massive concern. So, and for me, what also is hyper concerning on top of all of that, as if this isn't a depressing enough of a picture, it's that our generation, Gen Z, millennials, are having an increasingly negative and deteriorating outlook on democracies and our working lives. So research from Cambridge University shows that youth in Canada and most Western democracies have lower levels of faith in democracies than any other age group, and that millennials across the world are more disillusioned with democracy than Gen X or baby boomers when they were at the same age. And even in Japan, because I know we have a Japanese audience, research from the Manpower Group shows that Japanese millennials have some of the lowest levels of optimism on their career prospects than any other developed nation in the world. And why is this the case? Well, you know, youth in Japan and Canada, Ipsos finds, is that we see our countries as out of control, and we're increasingly fed up with the crisis of leadership that exists in our countries. And we're not completely wrong to believe this. At the European Commission, they had a report 8 years after the Great Recession of 2007, 2008. A third of young people remain at risk of poverty or social exclusion, where they faced long-term unemployment or underemployment. And this was even the case in the countries like Australia that did a great job. So very depressing. So what are the implications of a global democratic recession? Well, if we lose faith in our democratic institutions, then we lose faith in, and we probably underutilized what I think is one of the most effective tools known to mankind in tackling social issues, which is combining the collective action and power through governments. And if we don't have faith in governments and we aren't bolstering it, we actually risk further escalating the crises that we're facing. So it's a bit of a downward spiral, that if we aren't trusting and we aren't building up our democratic institutions, we're not actually going to be able to solve the crises that are causing us to lose faith in democracy in the first place. And at worst as well, we also increase the likelihood of having toxic populist leaders prey on the desperate and apathetic voters, such as Donald Trump, who aren't necessarily the cause of these democratic recessions, but they're the reasons that they ride into power. But at the same time, they're also one of the things that reinforces people's lack of faith in democracies in the first place. So, very depressing image. But what's the solution here? Well, let's talk about that. My bias is that I think we're going to need to have a massive progressive retrofitting of our democratic institutions. I think that we have we have 20th century democratic institutions and policies that are trying to operate and tackle issues of the 21st century. And if history has taught us anything, it's that the future does not fit in the containers of the past, and that we need to be able to shake things up. I think what's giving me hope is that we're now seeing an emerging consensus on the reforms that need to take place in our societies that would have been considered far too radical in the past. So, for instance, those include, let's say, maybe guarantee annual income, massive investments in public welfare, transition to renewables, universal digital access to broadband, redistributive tax policies such as like a really large super wealth tax or super inheritance tax, regulations on big tech and data privacy, policing reforms. Like we're seeing all these things that for the most part there seems to be an emerging consensus that this now kind of makes sense. And I think that's rather interesting, and also what I feel like is different this time. If I think back to when I was an undergrad student during the Great Recession in 07, 08, is that you're finding large institutions who normally you wouldn't think would kind of be on the same page with these kind of reforms, now also advancing them too. So that I remember at the time IMF, International Monetary Fund, during the 07, 08 crisis, massively discouraged and stifled countries from adopting expansive fiscal policies to help recover their economies and to save their people. And now the IMF is encouraging countries to borrow what they need, spend whatever it is to implement bold and daring policies. We're having huge, big businesses and industry and institutions like the World Economic Forum now push for a great reset. A set of policies that would build back better, meaning a more equitable, inclusive, and sustainable society. So this moment feels different. There seems to be an emerging consensus between those who are marching and between those in industry and the so-called elites, right? And I think what's comforting for me to know is that in history, we've been here many times before. And, as they say, those who don't know the history are bound to repeat it. So, what are the lessons from the past? Well, in short, governments need to step up in times of crises and transform themselves in the process for lasting change. Uh, Best example here is probably the Great Depression of the 1930s. In the U.S., at the time, the New York Times wrote that the future of democracy was one of the number one topics that Americans were discussing, in their dining room tables, and that if we think things were bad now, the 1930s was tough. They just got out of a pandemic. There was a world war that happened before, a financial crash, and at the time, folks were losing lots of faith in democracy. And then we had President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal and his expansive set of public policy reforms that spanned from new public work programs to strict financial regulations, all of which ended up spurring America's recovery and also Americans' faith in democracy over again. And during that same time, we had Canada. We were also facing a Great Depression. What had happened? Well, unlike FDR, our politicians actually refused to let go of kind of a laissez-faire philosophy and a fixation on preserving the nation's credit at whatever the cost. So as the federal government tried to kind of evade their responsibilities and show even reluctance, frankly, that a crisis was happening, we had provinces and cities just fiscally collapse. We had rates of poverty and food insecurity go through the roof. And finally, after a couple of years within the recession, Prime Minister of the day, R.B. Bennett, took a 180-degree policy turn, announced a new deal to kind of mirror what FDR did. And then this had charted the course for the economic recovery of the time, but also it created the government of Canada that we know today. It created federal unemployment insurance. It's created the Bank of Canada, the CBC, and other vital public institutions. So we've been here before, and at these moments where it feels like we're at a fork in the road, and we know what it looks like to go down both paths of action and inaction. You can either try to ask yourself, what is it that we do to get out of this problem, or how is it that we change to get ourselves out of this problem and to be even more prosperous in the future? But at the end of the day, making these changes aren't going to be easy. Debates, folks are now steeped in pessimism. As Keynes said, there are revolutionaries who think that things are so bad nothing can save us but from violent change, and then there are reactionaries who consider that the balance of economic and social life are so precarious that we must risk no experiments. And for those wanting to have a better world, we have to kind of stave off these politicians and win over these citizens if we want to drive this change. And the other big challenge I think now is that research from Edelman shows that, and this is during the pandemic, businesses are now seen as the only institutions as both competent and ethical in comparison to NGOs, to the media, to the government, and the government was also seen as incompetent, unethical, and the businesses were seen as the most trustworthy as well in terms of news sources. So um, with this in mind, there's a concern though that while there's an emerging consensus from industry and from the types of the IMF and the World Economic Forum that we risk kind of leaving it up to the private sector and to the generous foundations to kind of help fill in the gaps of the public sector and to shape the agenda and on kind of what is it that we need to focus on, whereas that should really be the role of citizens to be driving that change. At the end of the day, I think we should be celebrating the embrace that these industries have had of progressive agendas. I think that's something worth celebrating, but I think we need to be cautious of not having watered down versions of ambitious agendas to radically transform our democracies and to reinstill faith in it. So there's that. The other point briefly is that we have a window of opportunity. This window of opportunity of driving these big changes aren't going to last forever. I think there's a great case of subsidized childcare in the U.S. during World War II. When women were urgently needed, the government they created a subsidized childcare network. The second the war ended, so did the support for these. So I think this is a good example of kind of we have to drive for this kind of change to take place and make it permanent as well and concretize it. So what is the call to action? Now, we've talked about the depressing challenge that lays before us, and the hope and the direction that we can go. What's the ultimate call to action? Well, it's you. It's our generation. We need you, the young, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed undergrads in our generation to kind of solve these. And they say the victims of a crisis aren't normally the ones who are normally the originators of it, but it is what it is, and what is not your fault is probably going to be your problem at the end of the day. And I think that our having all these issues at stake for us, it implores us to actually take action here. Um, Now, let's see. Yes, yes. Uh, I like to also add this quote: "Is it's easier to invent the future than to predict it." Big fan of that quote. And the concern I have, particularly with youth in our generation, is that my concern is that with these remarkably low levels of trust that folks have in governments and whatnot, is that we're just going to have a lot of folks who are going to drive these changes only through private enterprises or foundations. And it's okay to obviously work at those places, but it's to not forget the impact that can be made with our public institutions as well, and to make sure that we keep our democracies and our public institutions alive and very healthy. So something for you to consider on as you reflect on your work, your careers, what's your next step from graduation. And let's get to the part on field notes. So I called it field notes because, as I had mentioned earlier, I'm humble enough to know that I'm still actively trying to figure out how to best drive change in our institutions and in society. And I wrote this because kind of like a cover my ass of saying it represents my latest unrefined thinking at the moment. And it's also worth noting here that I think there's a bit of a caveat with some of this advice, which is it's tailored for a specific type of leader. And because I have this belief that there's an ecosystem of leadership where you have various roles played by various people who are doing various things. So you have thought leaders and academics who are bringing new ideas and insights outside of the mainstream. You have journalists who popularize those ideas, spark public debates, activists who work to build consensus and political pressure to make those ideas reality, politicians who respond to the public's demands to translate these ideas into reality. Like it's there's a lot of different stuff, and I'd say this advice is probably more relevant to those who are at the activists and aspiring politicians, or as President Teddy Roosevelt would say, and this is going to be a long quote, not the critic, but the man, who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust, sweat, and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who spends himself in a worth cause, who at the best knows in the end of the triumph, and the triumph of high achievement, who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be those with the cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat. Lengthy quote. Felt like I was going to drop that in there. Let's go ahead and get started with the three kind of tips that I have on change making based on some of my experiences. First, EQ plus mission is greater than IQ, and don't be a smart idiot. So to explain that, I'm going to sip a bit of water and describe the story here. Okay. So what I wanted to bring up here is one of the organizations I work for, we that I'm on the board for, we kind of cooperate a low income housing unit for vulnerable Black and Indigenous folks in Vancouver's downtown east side. For those not familiar with that, also known as, I think, if not the poorest code, at least one of them, the poorest postal code in Canada. And it's, we have a housing unit of 60 folks who are recovering, let's say, drug addicts or who are in precarious situations. So when the pandemic had started, we wanted to mobilize and we wanted to make sure that we were providing care for these residents. Normally the organization and the way things would work is we kind of brainstorm some ideas and try to implement it. Instead of kind of just trusting that we're smart enough to know what would be best. I had the idea that look, let's at least throw out a survey to folks, to the various like Black community groups that we're a part of on Facebook, on WhatsApp, whatever it is. Just a very brief Google survey saying, hey, we're trying to care for these folks that are vulnerable during the pandemic. Do you have ideas on things we can do? But more importantly, let's ask a question of saying, hey, great idea. Would you be willing to do it? So give folks the opportunity to get engaged. Not only did that help us brainstorm greater ideas, because you had some folks who were social workers, some folks who were more familiar with that area who gave us ideas, but it also ended up building community and building a volunteer base for folks that we could tap into that ended up really running our entire program. Um, and then after that, I worked on worked with TELUS to secure free smartphones for all these residents. And it was when we were there distributing the phones, our thinking is like, look, we want folks to be able to tell us what we think would be best for them from a programming standpoint, from the weekly hampers and meals that we provide them, because we didn't want to necessarily be operating in isolation, hoping that the programs that we're delivering aren't really landing or resonating with them. So that's kind of a good example of of trying to be empathetic and getting close to the constituents that you're best trying to serve, and using that as opposed to the intelligence of others as opposed to just the intelligence of your own to better understand ways that you can better serve. So uh, and I think that if we had more folks in the top high lead echelons of government, of industry, of what have you, in the past who had adopted these kinds of approaches, where they had used their empathy as opposed to necessarily their degrees from McGill or wherever top, or University of Alberta, wherever top institution you came from, that we would have better served public institutions. But the concern is that folks can be smart idiots, where on paper you're brilliant, but essentially your confidence and arrogance essentially makes you believe that you kind of know what you need to know, and you don't necessarily have to really be connecting from the downstream standpoint of with the folks that you're trying to best serve. And I think that this has contributed to a lot of the problems that we're having today. And even if we think back to history, there's so many examples of like even during FDR's day, one of his close brain trust advisors, he would during at the height of the Great Depression, the New Deal, he would hire folks in local towns to just say, I need to know the truth of what is actually happening. Are people using these relief programs? What's wrong? What's bad? Really trying to be empathetic and understand, what's working and what's not. Right. I think for those who know, one of the most prominent African American thinkers, W.E.B. Du Bois, once he was once commissioned to kind of investigate a challenge of like the challenges of this one neighborhood, and his approach was to literally move into that neighborhood, and this was during the 1800s, to walk door to door, to talk to folks in the community, like really try to embed yourself in the groups that you're trying to serve and the problems that you're trying to solve. And the closer that you can get, the better that you can be in solving these problems and actually driving a change that's effective, and really that's going to be more lasting. So, second piece of advice: show and tell, and practice starting, not perfecting. And really, this is one that I struggle the most with. Um, uh, a good story here is one of the things that I've been working on at work, which is developing this strategy for the way that the way that our firm, Deloitte, can best serve government in tackling the issue of the climate crisis. Uh, you know, an example of that is, we had a lot of folks who spent a bunch of time just kind of talking consistently about what is it that we should be doing without anyone really, frankly, doing the work of putting that to paper, of driving that, of doing some action, of driving this process forward. And what ends up happening, and most of the times, if you end up working for a large business or institution, is that the folks who kind of end up taking the initiative to actually get the work done are very quickly at the forefront of actually leading that work, even when you don't really necessarily have the title to be at the front. And that's most certainly what's happened with me at the firm, of just kind of taking the initiative of developing a strategy, developing a playbook that articulates the kinds of services that we can offer, examples, client stories, resources, building a community, finding people to drive, just moving that forward as opposed to endlessly talking. I think there's a bad habit of folks wanting to hash it out and get it perfect, but for me, a lot of the documents that I produce, frankly, are always in a state of a working draft, is what I call it, because I find it that it's easier to socialize that with folks, and it's also easier for you to move on, right? Because I never really see any of my products as final or perfect by any means, and if I was to ever get it to that state, it would never end up getting done. I think in a good example of the show and tell is when I was elected vice president and president of our students union at the University of Alberta, go Golden Bears. Um, one of the big things at the time was the provincial election. After the provincial election, we were trying to change legislation to make it easier for students to vote who weren't from the province. The approach we ended up taking, and that I was, instead of us meeting in front of the chief electoral officer and trying to make our case, let's just bring a student who got screwed over to this meeting, have him tell the story, and also try to put the chief electoral officer in the position of having to justify why the system needs to remain the way it is. And let's bring testimonials from students and whatnot to really show the impact of this policy. And we didn't end up convincing him, but we convinced his boss, the Minister of Justice, and then we were able to successfully have legislation changed, make it easier for students to vote, which was awesome. So I think there's a lot of good lessons there. I think folks are kind of increasingly losing faith these days because there's a sense of we're kind of continually circling and talking about these issues without actually doing much. I think folks react best when they see examples, when they see pilots taking place that are actually trying to move the needle forward and drive a change. And one of the things I struggle with is trying to not perfect things and being okay with incremental progress, whether it's a deliverable or even just a policy change. That for me is probably one of the harder things I'm working on, but I think it's a useful lesson to share. And lastly, BBC squared: build better, broader coalitions and be better collaborators. The example there, or the importance of this, is that with the problems that we're facing, which are so complex, systemic, we're going to need to. We can't kind of go it alone. And an example here is during my time back at Students Union, when I got elected, literally the day after I got elected president, the provincial government, the Progressive Conservatives at the time, announced, at the time, I think it was like the largest cuts to post-secondary education. And there's potential of tuition increases and fee increases. And it was kind of my role and the role of other recently elected student leaders to kind of figure out, what are we going to do to best serve students? We could have taken an approach of just sticking it to our base, which are just students, and riling them up and doing lots of protesting, which we also did. But I thought that there would be merit in trying to establish a coalition between academic staff, non-academic staff, between other folks who are interested in the post-secondary education sector, and establish this collaboration of sorts, such that we can go to the government to kind of present a united front of saying, look, here's our perspective on how we think the future of post-secondary education needs to look like in this province. Irrespective of these cuts right now, let's think about what the endpoint needs to be, and then reflect on whether these cuts are actually going to help us get to where we need to go. If our provincial coffers are drying up because we've overinvested in oil and gas as a province, what is it that we're needing to do to kind of like have a more prosperous and sustainable economy within Alberta? And how does education play a role in that? Ended up building and exciting a large base of stakeholders together across the province. Did lots of stakeholder conversations, meetings, getting buy-in, and we were able to pull off what I think is still this day the largest student-led consultative initiative on post-secondary education in Canada, where we ended up sending email surveys, focus groups with students from across the entire province, and then putting that forward to the government. And then they invested millions of dollars into open educational resources. They had announced certain policy changes as a result. So I think the lesson there is that you need to kind of stray away from just your base, and there's a lot to be gained from doing so. And history has shown us that during periods of social reform, you've always had these abnormal coalitions take place. And even if we look at FDR's New Deal at the time in the 1930s, you had this coalition of blue collar workers, farmers, white Southerners, intellectuals. Like, you had this weird hodgepodge of coalition, but that was able to make it successful. And I think for a lot of these changes that we're going to be needing to drive forward, that's what we're going to need. Um, and something to note here is that we also have the most intergenerational workforce in history. We have Gen Zs, we have millennials, we have Gen X, baby boomers who are in the workforce, who are in our community groups. So learning how to navigate and successfully work across generations is not only critical, but frankly, it's going to be really valuable and profitable skill set at work. I am having to deal with that a lot, not only at work, but my community organizing, and it's really freaking hard, but it's really fruitful when you can get it right. So, and to be a better collaborator, a large part of that is just being a good empathizer. So that kind of goes back to the first point that I had as well. So hopefully you folks find, a couple of nuggets of wisdom from these stories. But yeah, I wanted to close off with a couple of thoughts, which is that, a lot of folks compare our time, the 2020s, this pandemic, back to the 1920s, 100 years ago, where there was after the pandemic of, what is it, 1918 to 1920, right? 2 years roughly. Like, now it feels like it's going to be a 2-year-long pandemic. At the time, they had a remarkably large, explosive economic growth that lasted for a couple of years. Standards of living improved as well, right? There was just this, there's a real sense of optimism. But what ended up happening was that, and on top of that, the stock market was really hot. You had stock prices during the 20s actually triple in value. So, it sounds eerily familiar to kind of the circumstances that we're going through or may potentially go through today, right? Now, the other thing to note, though, is that there's also remarkably large levels of deflation, where you had prices go down, which was helpful to consumers, but then you also had a lot of farmers who had to shut down shop. The agricultural industry took a huge hit, and then you also saw at this time the rise or the resurrection of the Ku Klux Klan, the rise of communism in Europe, and the rise of fascist and authoritarian leaders in Europe, and authoritarian leaders in Japan. Like, you also, while there was a lot of this optimism and growth, you also had a lot of these other a bit of social and political unrest or change, upheaval that was happening simultaneously. And then the economy, while it was hot for 3 years, it then kind of teetered out. It was really volatile. You had some years that were great, some years that were negative. And then it all culminated to 1929, when there was, at least in the US, there was a huge crash, financial stock market crash, where essentially erased all the gains that they made in the past decade from a financial standpoint. And then following the 1920s, you had the Great Depression. Following the Great Depression, you had World War II. Why do I say this? I say this because it's a reminder to me that, look, I don't think that our course is going to essentially be outlined or followed perfectly as it was in the 1920s, but we essentially, for those of us who are passionate about public service and about social justice, we have our work cut out for ourselves. And while there's a window of opportunity now, there's still going to be a lot of work forward to not only reinvent and reform our public institutions, but to also safeguard it as well. So the work continues. And I want to end off, it's Black History Month, in case those of you who don't know. I want to end off with a James Baldwin quote, one of my favorite writers. And he says, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And I think that's a really good reminder that no one's coming to save us but ourselves. So now go do some great things, and email me if you have any thoughts, feedback. Follow me on Twitter, whatever it is, and I'm looking forward to kind of having the chance to connect with you all during the one-on-ones. All the best. Thank you for listening. Really appreciate it, and talk to you folks next time.